Snow moved sideways through the oaks, not falling but driven, powder so fine it hissed against the bark like thrown sand. The sky at the tree line had gone a color between green and gray, the color a bruise turns just before it spreads. No birds, no cattle sounds. Only the low hum of wind running through the telegraph wire above the frozen slough. A girl turned sideways through a gash in the trunk of an oak, so wide 3 men could not have linked arms around it. She carried a blanket, a tin box, and one mitten. Beneath the roots, in a hollow where bark curled back from an old scar, sat a second mitten, dry, folded, and placed there weeks before anyone knew she would need it. Randy Moen stood behind Belle's store with everything she owned pressed against her chest. A wool blanket, a sewing tin, a blunt knife, one mitten. Warm January water dripped from the roof and darkened the packed snow at her feet. Orson Bell had said the words 10 minutes ago. $2 missing from the register drawer. A torn lining in the sewing box she carried. He had not asked her where the tear came from. He had not let her open the box herself. He had turned to Constable Kittredge and said the word thief, and the room had changed. She was off the property before Bell finished talking to the constable's back. The oak was 1¾ miles northwest through the river woods past the Cattail Slough. Sunset sat less than 4 hours away. Her emergency cache held roughly 9 pounds of cornmeal, 5 pounds of dried beans, 2 pounds of lard, 3 pounds of dried apples, 4 pounds of salt pork, and a jar of salt. At tight winter rations, the food lasted 12 days, maybe 14 if she cut portions to the edge of what her body could stand. She could not leave. She had no fare for a stage, no relatives within reach, no guardian willing to hear her side before Kittredge brought her back to the state school in Owatonna with Bell's version of events entered as fact. A child marked incorrigible at 12 did not get placed again. She got kept. Randy wrapped her damaged left wrist against the cold and walked. The wrist had been weak since the previous spring, when she had fallen carrying a full water bucket across the Bell yard before dawn. She had not told anyone. Telling meant admitting the bucket was too heavy, and admitting the bucket was too heavy meant admitting she was too small, and admitting she was too small gave Bell a reason to send her back and request a stronger child. She had entered the Minnesota State Public School for dependent and neglected children 8 months after her mother died. The institution sat on a low hill in Owatonna, brick walls, iron beds, a smell of boiled starch and floor soap that never left her hair. She was 7. Her father had taken seasonal work on the railroad extension west of Worthington and had not come back. The school kept her for 11 months before a placement agent matched her to the Bell household outside Medford. The Bells needed a girl who could sew grain sacks, sort seed, mend harness leather, milk before light, and keep quiet. Randy did all 5. She slept on a pallet beside the kitchen stove. Orson Bell supplied 1 dress, 1 pair of boots, and 1 wool coat per year, the minimum the placement agreement required. He recorded the cost of each item against her labor at figures she was not permitted to see. By her 3rd autumn with the Bells, Randy understood 3 things about her position. First, she would never be paid. Second, Bell kept a ledger of inflated expenses that made her labor appear to cost more than it produced. Third, the only exit that did not lead back to the state school was the one she built herself. She had started hiding food in September, not stolen food. Cornmeal Guro Stensland gave her for mending a seed bag, beans gleaned from the edges of a harvested field, left in the dirt because Bell's crew did not stoop for handfuls. Windfall apples dried on a flat stone behind the slough. Salt pork purchased with 3 months of egg money. 6 cents a week from the hens Bell let her tend, because he considered eggs beneath his time. Every ounce was earned or discarded by someone else before Randy touched it. She had carried the cash to the oak in small loads across 7 weeks, wrapped in oilcloth, suspended from a cord inside the cavity where mice could not reach it. She had prepared because she was not stupid. She had prepared because a child without money, family, or legal standing could not afford to be surprised. And now Orson Bell had surprised her anyway, with $2 silver she had never touched, and a torn sewing box she had not torn. Kittredge caught up with her at the river road. He was 54, lean from decades of fence work and road grading, and he carried the authority of the township on his shoulders the way other men carried debt, visibly and without complaint. He had survived more than 20 Minnesota winters. He had survived the war before that. He did not raise his voice. He said, "Randy, stop walking." She stopped. He looked at the blanket, the sewing tin, the single mitten. He looked at the sky, which had gone pale and soft in a way that made the air feel 10 degrees warmer than it should have been in January. "You know, I have to bring you back," he said. "To Bell?" "To Owatonna. Bell does not want you returned to him. He wants you returned to the school with a notation." Randy said nothing. Kittredge shifted his weight. He was not comfortable. She could see that. He did not fully believe Bell's accusation. She could see that too, in the way he looked at the sewing tin without opening it. But he believed something worse. He believed a child outdoors in January was a greater danger than a false charge indoors. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked. She did not answer. "There's nothing out there for you. The river timber is cut through or spoken for. The slough freezes to mud. You have no cabin, no stove, no provisions worth the name." He paused. "I have seen that tree you visit." Her stomach dropped. "A hollow tree is a coffin with bark on it," Kittredge said. "You go inside during a hard freeze, the air around you drops below what your blood can stand, and you do not wake up. That is not an opinion. That is arithmetic." Randy said, "The arithmetic changes if you make the space small enough." Kittredge looked at her for a long time, then he shook his head. "You are 12 years old," he said. "You weigh less than my dog. I'm not going to stand in this road and argue construction theory with a child who owns one mitten." He turned back toward Bell's store to collect the paperwork. Randy crossed between the granary and the tree line before he finished his second step. She ran until her left wrist throbbed from clutching the sewing tin against the blanket roll. Then she walked fast. Then she ran again. The cattle in the field west of the road had turned their hindquarters to the northwest. She noticed because her mother had taught her to notice, not with words, but with a hand on Randy's shoulder, turning her toward the animals and waiting until Randy saw what the animals already knew. Cattle faced away from weather that was coming. When they clustered tight and refused to move, the weather was close. These cattle were not clustered yet. But they had turned. Above the tree line, the telegraph wire had begun to hum. A low, steady vibration that meant wind was building somewhere she could not yet feel it. The sky behind her, south and east, remained pale. The sky ahead, northwest, had gone the color of an old bruise, not dark, not storming, just wrong. She entered the woods at the gap where the old cattle path crossed a dry creek. The snow here was shallow, shaded by oaks and basswood, and her boots left clear prints she could not hide. If Kittredge followed, he would find the tree within the hour. She could not control that. She could only reach it first. The air changed before she saw the slough. It went from cold but soft to something that pressed against her face like a damp hand. The barometric drop came through her sinuses. The clouds had thickened without her seeing them thicken. Time was compressing. She smelled frozen cattails and standing water beneath ice. The slough opened to her left. Through the bare trunks beyond it, she saw the oak. The tree had been waiting since before anyone in Steele County could remember. Randy had found it the previous September while chasing a bell calf that had waded into the cattail margin. The bur oak stood on a steep, flood-scarred strip between the slough and the higher ground, soil too wet for plowing, too steep for easy harvest, too tangled with deadfall for Bell's cordwood crew to bother dragging equipment through. Its trunk measured 23 feet around. She knew this because she had wrapped a cord around it 4 times and measured the cord against a yardstick Guro kept in her kitchen. A bur oak of this size was rare, but not impossible. The species grew enormous in the savanna country of southern Minnesota, where fire and open ground gave the strongest trees room to spread. This one had claimed its ground and held it for what Randy guessed was 200 years or more. An old lightning scar ran from a high branch down to a point 6 feet above the root flare. The scar had opened the bark. Decay fungi had entered the dead heartwood beneath. Over decades, the rot had hollowed the center, while the living sapwood continued growing around it, a tube of life surrounding a cavity of slow destruction. The entrance was narrow. Randy turned sideways to pass through it. Inside, the cavity measured 4 feet 4 inches across at its widest, nearly 6 feet from front to back, and more than 10 feet from floor to the ragged upper opening where the scar met sound wood. She had first used it to escape rain. Nothing more. A dry place to sit while the calf grazed near the slough. But she had noticed things. The wind that tore through the upper branches barely stirred the dry leaves on the cavity floor. She had held a thread in the entrance and watched it hang nearly still while the oaks outside bent and creaked. The tree was stopping wind. Not all of it. Gusts found the entrance, and the upper scar admitted drafts. But the cavity was calmer than any open-air shelter she had seen. The air inside felt warmer than the air outside. Not warm, not comfortable, but the stillness itself was a kind of warmth. Moving air stole heat from skin. Still air let the skin keep what it made, and the interior was too large. That was the problem she could feel before she could name it. The cavity was big enough to stand in, big enough to pace 3 steps in any direction, big enough that her body heat rose to the upper opening and vanished. She was warming a chimney. Her lungs and skin produced heat. The tree let it escape. The memory came back the way her mother's lessons always came back, not as words first, but as a feeling. The cold room in the Albert Lay house. The quilt her mother hung from the ceiling around Randy's bed, making a tent so small that Randy's knees touched the fabric when she rolled over. Her mother's hand pressed flat against the wool. "We cannot heat the house," her mother had said. "We can only heat the air next to the sleeper." Randy had scratched a rectangle into the soft, punky interior wood of the oak with a nail, 30 inches wide, 66 inches long, 36 inches high. Enough room for a child to lie flat with 2 inches of clearance above her chest and 6 inches on either side. She would not warm the tree. She would warm the bed. The idea obeyed physics. Randy could feel that it obeyed physics, because she could feel the difference between standing in the open cavity and crouching in the corner with her blanket pulled overhead. The smaller the space, the faster her body raised its temperature, the slower the heat escaped. But the idea depended on execution she did not yet possess. She needed a frame for the sleeping berth, bent wood or willow ribs. She needed an outer layer to stop drafts. She needed insulation thick enough to slow conduction through the walls. 4 inches at minimum, Guro would later tell her. She needed an inner layer to keep loose fiber from falling on her face or contacting any heat source. She needed the floor raised above the cold, wet ground. She needed ventilation for her breath, or the moisture from her lungs would condense, freeze, and coat every surface with ice that melted by day and soaked the insulation. She needed all of this built in secret, with no money, no adult authority, and no margin for error. And she needed food the shelter could not provide. A child her size needed roughly 1,500 calories a day at rest in cold weather. Her cash lasted 12 to 14 days. Winter lasted until April. The gap was enormous. She was gambling everything: her autumn labor, her secrecy, her food supply, her safety, on a hollow tree that might collapse in wind, fill with smoke if she tried fire, soak through in a thaw, attract animals, or be discovered and dismantled by Orson Bell before the first hard frost. The practical voice in her head sounded exactly like Ruth Grant's. Ruth had caught her in October, carrying a flour sack stuffed with dry cattail heads along the road past the Cran's farm. Ruth was 15, raw-boned, and practical in the way that girls who milked 8 cows before school became practical. She did not mock easily. She understood hunger better than most adults admitted. She looked at the sack. She looked at Randy. "What are you doing with cattail fluff?" Ruth asked. "Insulation," Randy said. "For what?" Randy did not answer. Ruth walked with her for a quarter-mile without speaking. Then she said, "You cannot eat insulation." "No," Randy said, "but I can stop feeding my heat to the wind." Ruth considered this. She was not cruel and not stupid. She understood that Randy had identified a real problem, heat loss, and was attempting a real solution, reducing exposed surface. But she also understood something Randy had not addressed. "Snowmelt will run into that hole," Ruth said. "I know which tree you mean. The ground slopes toward it. The entrance faces the wrong direction for winter drainage. You will be lying in a puddle by November." Randy had not solved the drainage problem. "And mice," Ruth said. "Loose fluff is a mouse nest. They will be inside your walls before you are." Ruth's objections forced 2 changes that probably saved Randy's life. The floor would need to be raised, not laid on the ground, but elevated on poles above a drainage path. And the insulation could not be loose. It had to be stitched into panels, enclosed between layers of cloth so that mice could not burrow in, and moisture could not saturate it without warning. Randy did not thank Ruth. Ruth did not expect thanks. They stood on the road in the October light, while the cattail heads caught the wind, and both of them understood that a problem had been named and a solution had been complicated. Ruth stopped speaking to Randy in public 3 weeks later because her father bought supplies on Bell's credit and could not afford the association. The mockery spread through Medford the way all small-town gossip spreads. Slowly at first, then everywhere at once. Men at the Clinton Falls mill saw Randy hauling sacks of moss, willow switches, and discarded feed bags along the river path. A mill hand named Fisk leaned against the stacked lumber and watched her pass. "Queen Randy," he said, loud enough for the loading crew. "Off to furnish the palace." The men laughed. Not viciously, the way men laugh at something too small to threaten them and too strange to ignore. The phrase caught. By the following week, it circulated at Bell's store, at the schoolyard, at the post office. Randy heard it from children who did not understand what it meant, and adults who understood exactly. She did not argue. She did not explain. She separated the wet moss from the dry, loaded the dry moss into her shoulder sack, and kept walking. The mockery remained grounded because, to any reasonable observer, a 12-year-old girl stuffing plant fiber into a decayed tree genuinely appeared foolish. The men at the mill were not villains. They were practical people making a practical judgment based on everything they knew about winter. They did not know what Randy's mother had taught her about the air next to the sleeper. Orson Bell knew the tree. He did not know what Randy was building inside it, but he knew she visited it, and he knew the general location because his seasonal cutting agreement covered damaged oak and deadfall on the river parcels. He followed her tracks in late October and lost them at the slough where frozen cattails broke under every footstep and the ground held no clear prints. He found her the next morning before she left for school. "Anything you build on my cutting ground belongs to me," Belle said. He stood in the kitchen doorway. Randy stood beside the stove, lacing her one good boot. His cutting agreement did not cover the living giant oak. It covered storm-damaged timber and deadfall, trees already down or too broken to stand. The bur oak was neither. But Belle understood something about power that Randy was still learning. The person who states a claim first forces the other person to disprove it. A 12-year-old indentured girl could not disprove a grown man's property claim in a community that bought flour from his store. "I have not built anything," Randy said. Which was true. She had measured. She had planned. She had cached food. But she had not yet driven a single peg or bent a single willow rib. Belle watched her face for the lie. He did not find it because it was not there. He confiscated one sack of dry moss from behind the woodshed and burned it in the yard while Randy walked to school. A week's work gone in 4 minutes of oily smoke. She rebuilt the supply in 6 days, gathering before dawn and after dark, carrying smaller loads that fit inside her coat. Belle began checking her bedding and pockets each evening. She responded by caching materials directly at the tree, accepting the risk that weather or animals would destroy them before she could use them. Every choice carried a cost. Every cost narrowed her margin, and the margin had been thin enough to begin with. The first construction happened in stolen hours. Randy worked at the oak between her final evening chores and full dark, a window of 40 to 90 minutes depending on the sunset and Belle's attention. She worked before dawn on days when Belle traveled to Owatonna for store supplies. She worked during the midday school break when she claimed she was eating lunch in the schoolyard. She did not eat lunch. She ate while walking. The sleeping birth frame came first. 4 willow ribs, cut green from the river bottom, steamed over Guro's kettle, the only part of the construction that required someone else's cooperation, and bent into arches. Each arch spanned 30 inches. She lashed them to the raised floor poles with cord stripped from a worn-out bell halter. The floor itself used 4 dead oak poles, each roughly 3 inches thick, resting on flat stones she carried from the creek. Cross slats of split willow sat on top. A removable mat of woven sedge covered the slats. She hauled stones until her left wrist sent sharp lines of pain up to the elbow. She carried willow until her shoulders cramped and her fingers could not close. She scraped drainage channels with the blunt knife until her right palm blistered, broke, and blistered again beneath the old skin. The physical cost was legible. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her 76 pounds dropped toward 70. The skin beneath her eyes darkened. Her hands cracked and bled in the cold air, and she wrapped them in strips torn from her only spare shift. By mid-November, the floor was complete, and the birth frame stood naked against the interior wall. 4 arches of bent willow supporting nothing, protecting nothing, proving nothing. The first setback arrived as rain. A warm day in the 3rd week of November sent water running down the slope, under the threshold, and across the cavity floor. The sedge mat soaked through. The drainage channel she had scraped proved too shallow by half. Water pooled beneath the raised poles and stood there, gray and still, for 2 days. Randy lost those 2 days, hauling the mat into weak sunlight, scraping the channel deeper, and packing a raised threshold of clay and flat stones across the entrance. The threshold added 3 inches of height. It was not elegant. It looked like a child had built it, because a child had, but it held. And while Randy rebuilt, Belle's eldest son opened her pallet beside the kitchen stove and searched through her bedding, her sewing box, and the single shelf where she kept her slate and reader. Ruth's youngest brother saw him do it and told Ruth. Ruth told Randy in a whisper at the school pump. "He's looking for the cash," Ruth said, "or proof of the cash, or anything your hands have touched that he can call stolen." Randy stared at the pump handle. Water dripped from the iron mouth onto frozen mud. "He will not find anything in the house," Randy said. "There is nothing in the house." Ruth looked at her. Ruth understood what that meant, that everything Randy valued was already at the tree, out of reach, beyond inspection, that the kitchen pallet was no longer home. That home was a hollow trunk 1 3/4 miles away, half built and unheated, where a child's arithmetic was being tested against a Minnesota winter. Ruth said nothing for a long moment. Then she pulled a folded grain sack from inside her coat and handed it to Randy without meeting her eyes. "It tore at the mill. Nobody recorded it," Ruth said. "I do not know you. I was not here." She walked away. That evening, by the last gray light of November, Randy stitched the first insulation panel from Ruth's sack and a double handful of dry cattail fiber. The panel was 18 inches square. She needed 14 more to line the sleeping berth. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been laughed at for preparing for something other people could not yet see? She worked by feel when the light failed. The needle found the cloth by memory. The cattail fiber compressed between her palms and filled the space between the layers, soft and dry, smelling of the slough in summer. Outside the oak, the temperature stood at 19 degrees and falling. Inside the cavity, without the berth finished, without fire, without a second human body, 18 degrees. 1 degree of difference? Almost nothing. But the berth was not finished. The panels were not hung. The curtain was not sewn. The heated brick was not wrapped. The sleeping space was still an idea drawn in chalk on punky wood, 30 inches by 66 inches by 36 inches, waiting to be tested against a winter that had barely started. And somewhere in the dark, moving through the slough with a lantern she would not light until she reached the trees, Guro Stensland was following the same path, not to rescue Randy, not to bring her food, but to press a knife point into the cavity wall and ask the only question that mattered. "Where do you intend to sleep?" Guro would say, "if the upper scar splits?" Randy did not have an answer. Not yet. The wind picked up. The oak groaned once above her, deep and low, the sound a living thing makes when the load on its body shifts. She pulled the half-stitched panel against her chest and counted the needle holes by touch. 14 more panels. 6 weeks until the deep cold. And somewhere between those numbers, the space between survival and failure, narrow as the berth she was building, dark as the inside of a tree, and measured in inches she could not afford to waste. Guro Stensland was already inside the tree. Randy pushed through the entrance and found the older woman crouching in the cavity, pressing the tip of a skinning knife into the interior wall with one hand and holding the flat of her other palm against the wood above it. She was listening, not with her ears, with her bones. Guro was 57, Norwegian-born, a widow whose husband had been a cooper, a man who built barrels, root cellars, smokehouses, and winter storage rooms from raw timber and iron bands. She had worked beside him for 23 years, learning the difference between wood that held weight and wood that only appeared to. She lived 2.5 miles from the Bell farm, kept a kitchen garden, a goat, and a reputation for midwifery that families relied on when roads were impassable and the doctor was in Owatonna. She owed Orson Bell $31.60 for seed, lamp oil, and a doctor's visit she had needed the previous March, and the debt kept her careful around him, the way a fence keeps a person on one side of a field, without needing to explain why. She had followed Randy to the oak because she had seen the girl sorting moss by dryness behind the Cran's barn. Not collecting moss, sorting it, weighing handfuls against each other, discarding the damp pieces, keeping only what crumbled dry between her fingers. That was not the behavior of a child playing house in a tree. That was the behavior of someone who understood that moisture changed the properties of a material. Guro did not praise the shelter. She did not comment on the raised floor or the willow arches, or the chalk rectangle scratched into the soft interior wood. She pressed the knife point deeper. "Dead," she said, and tapped the wall with the handle. A dull, dry sound. "This is heartwood, rotted through. You could push your thumb into it." She moved the knife 6 inches to the right and tapped again. The sound changed, higher, tighter, with a ring beneath it. "Living," she said. "Sapwood. This is carrying the weight of every branch above you." She looked at Randy. "Do you understand the difference?" "One holds the tree up," Randy said. "One does not." "One holds you alive," Guro said. "The other is the space you sleep in. If you cut into the living wood to make your room bigger, you weaken the only thing standing between you and the sky." She stood, pressing both hands against the wall at shoulder height, and pushed. The dead heartwood gave slightly. The living sapwood did not move. "Show me where you would sleep if the upper scar splits," Guro said. Randy pointed to the chalk rectangle. It sat against the thinnest section of wall, directly beneath the vertical channel where the lightning damage ran highest. Guro shook her head. "There," she said, and pointed to the opposite side, the thickest root flare, where 3 massive roots converged, and the sapwood measured more than 8 inches deep. "If the scar opens, it opens along the existing damage. You sleep on the side that has no damage." They moved the chalk rectangle that night. Randy scraped the old marks away and redrew the berth against the root flare. 30 inches by 66 inches by 36 inches, the same dimensions, the same math, rotated to the safe side of a danger she had not recognized. Guro propped a diagonal brace of dead oak beneath a compromised interior shelf where the heartwood sagged. The brace would not save the tree if the trunk truly failed, but it would buy seconds, enough time to roll toward the entrance rather than freeze in place. The lessons came in visits, not lectures, not scheduled instruction. Guro arrived when she could, carrying something, a tool, a material, a question. The floor needed improvement. Randy had built it at roughly 6 inches above the cavity base. Guro wanted 10. "Cold air pools," Guro said. "Water finds the lowest surface. 6 inches is wading depth. 10 inches keeps the sleeper above the worst of it." They rebuilt the support using 4 dead oak poles resting on flat stones Randy had already placed. Guro showed her how to check each pole for soundness by flexing it across her knee. 2 of Randy's original poles failed the test. They cracked without warning, not bending, not groaning, just snapping where internal rot had weakened fibers that looked solid from outside. "Wood lies the same way people lie," Guro said. "It looks strong until you ask it to work." Cross slats of split willow sat on the poles. A removable mat of woven sedge covered the slats. Beneath the raised floor, a shallow drainage path led toward the entrance without cutting new holes into the living wood. Guro insisted on this. Every opening weakened the trunk. Every weakness invited failure. The drainage channel worked until it didn't. The first hard November rain entered beneath the entrance threshold, the same threshold Randy had already raised once, and pooled beneath the floor. They added 2 inches of height to the threshold using clay-packed stones pressed into a bed of gravel. Water still seeped, but it followed the drainage path now instead of standing. Moisture was the lesson Guro returned to most often. She hung 2 bundles from a cord inside the cavity one evening, one bundle of dry moss, one bundle of the same moss soaked in water and wrung out. By morning, the wet bundle was rimed with white frost, stiff, heavy, and cold to the touch. The dry bundle remained soft and light. Cold is honest, Guro said. Wet lies until night. She pulled the wet bundle free and held it against her forearm. The cold went through to the bone in seconds. The dry bundle, held against the other arm, barely registered. Dry fiber traps air, she said. Air slows heat from passing through. Wet fiber conducts heat the way a nail conducts heat. Touch a dry nail in winter. Now touch a wet one. You understand? Randy understood. She had felt the difference every time she handled damp wool versus dry wool in Belle's mending pile. She had not connected the sensation to the physics. They used moss only as replaceable chinking in the protected inner lattice of the berth, packed between the willow ribs, never pressed tightly against the living sapwood where it might trap moisture against the wood surface. The primary insulation would be cattail fiber, mixed with sedge and shredded wool waste, stitched into panels between 2 layers of cloth. Each panel contained approximately 4 inches of compressed dry fiber. Randy stitched 14 panels using Ruth's torn grain sack, 3 additional feed sacks scavenged from the mill road, and 2 pieces of worn canvas Guro contributed from her own dwindling supplies. The stitching took 9 days. Her fingers cramped, the needle bent. She broke 2 needles and straightened them on a stone. A high existing knot opening in the trunk wall, roughly 1.5 inches across, became the exhaust vent. Warm, moist air from Randy's breathing would rise and escape through it. A lower gap beneath the entrance baffle supplied replacement air, fresh, cold, but necessary. Both openings were screened with woven horsehair to deter mice. The ventilation balanced heat loss against moisture removal. Too little airflow meant condensation. Too much meant freezing. Randy would need to adjust the lower gap by hand during occupancy, reading conditions by the feel of the air on her face and the dampness of the inner cloth. Boat, fire was the last lesson, and Guro taught it with a line in the dirt. She dragged her heel across the ground 8 feet from the trunk and said, "No flame crosses this mark. Not a candle. Not a match. Not a coal." Randy looked at the line. 8 feet seemed generous. The entrance was more than 6 feet from the berth. "Cattail fiber burns," Guro said. "Dry wool burns, punky heartwood burns. Decayed oak burns slower than pine, but faster than you can put it out with a cup of water and one good hand. If a flame touches the inside of that tree, you die before you reach the entrance." They dug a small clay-lined cooking trench on the leeward side of the tree, beyond the line. Guro built a covered ember box from flat stones, a miniature firebox where coals could be maintained without open flame contacting the wind. 2 dry fire brick fragments, scavenged from a dismantled Kranz stove, could be heated in the trench, placed in an iron kettle wrapped with cloth, and carried to the sleeping berth. The bricks held useful heat for roughly 3 hours, not comfort, not warmth the way a stove provided warmth, but enough to raise the air inside the berth by several degrees. The difference between shivering sleep and no sleep at all. The rule was simple and absolute. The tree was a fuel source, not a fireplace. A single mistake would convert shelter into pyre. By late November, the countdown had become arithmetic. Randy performed every morning, 24 pounds of staple food cached. At reduced rations, cornmeal mush, beans, dried apple, salt pork in small pieces. It lasted 12 to 14 days. Guro had agreed to exchange weekly staples for labor, mending, herb sorting, rabbit hides from 2 functional snares Randy tended along the slough. The exchange was not charity. Guro needed work her arthritic hands could no longer perform. She needed sewing done. She needed bundles of dried herbs sorted and tied. She needed someone with young fingers and steady patience, but the arrangement depended on Guro's ability to reach the tree. 2.5 miles in fair weather. In a blizzard, that distance became impassable. 35 pounds of dry cooking wood sat beneath the bark-covered lean-to past the fire line. The wood supply would last longer than the food. The inner berth was half insulated. 7 panels hung. 7 remained. The entrance still lacked its second wind baffle, a double curtain system that would create a dead air pocket between the outer opening and the inner cavity. Without it, every gust pushed cold air directly into the space Randy was trying to warm, and Bell had begun marking trees on the river parcel. His crew would start cutting in early January, working their way north from the damaged timber closest to the road. The giant oak was not damaged timber, and his agreement did not cover living trees. But the crew would pass within 200 yards. They would see smoke from the cooking trench. They would see tracks in the snow. They would see Randy. The setbacks arrived in sequence, each one shaving days from the timeline. Mice chewed through the first sack panel, the oldest one, stitched in October, where Randy had left a gap in the horsehair screen. She lost 3 days insulation and half a pound of cattail fiber that the mice shredded into nest material. A December thaw sent water under the floor again, soaking the lowest sedge mat. She hauled the mat out, hung it in cold wind, and waited 2 days for it to dry. During those 2 days, she slept on bare willow slats with her blanket pulled tight and her teeth clenched against the shaking. Bell's crew removed one structural pole from the cavity entrance during a scouting trip, mistaking it for deadfall firewood. The pole had supported the upper edge of the entrance baffle frame. Without it, the baffle cloth sagged and admitted a direct draft that erased 3 degrees of temperature difference in the outer cavity within an hour. Randy replaced it with a green willow pole that flexed but held. She sliced her right palm, splitting willow for cross slats. The cut was shallow but long, from the base of her thumb to the heel of her hand, and it bled into the fibrous wood and would not close cleanly in the cold. She wrapped it with a strip of cloth soaked in salt water and continued working because stopping was not an option the calendar allowed. Guro's debt to Bell prevented her from purchasing new canvas. She could not buy materials from his store without drawing attention. She could not ask neighbors without explaining what the materials were for. Every resource was scarce, watched, or borrowed against future labor that Randy's small body could barely sustain. Kittredge appeared on the river path in the second week of December. He was not looking for Randy specifically. He was overseeing the road condition before a county board meeting and had walked the tree line to inspect a drainage ditch. But he saw the lean-to. He saw the tracks. He stopped. Randy was inside the cavity, hanging the 9th panel. She heard his boots crunch on frozen ground and went still. He did not enter. He stood at the entrance and looked at the baffle, the raised threshold, the interior dark beyond it. He could not see the berth from outside. "Still here," he said. Not a question. Randy said nothing. "Still a coffin," he said. "You have only padded the lid." He looked at the sky, looked at the lean-to, looked at the thin trail of her footprints disappearing toward the slough. "When it gets bad," he said, "and it will get bad, come to my house. My wife will take you in for the night. You can sort your situation in the morning. Randy said, I will remember. She did not mean she would come. She meant she would remember that he offered. The distinction was the kind of thing a 12-year-old understood in her chest rather than her words. Kittredge walked away. His footprints crossed hers at the lean-to and continued south along the river road. That night, Randy hung the 10th panel and measured the air temperature inside the berth for the first time using a mercury thermometer Guro had lent her from her husband's Cooper's kit. The reading was 26 degrees. Outside, the air stood at 14. 12 degrees of difference, and the berth was not yet complete. She wrote the numbers on a scrap of brown paper and tucked it behind the 10th panel, the first entry in what would become a winter-long record. The first full test came on a December night when the outside temperature settled at approximately 6 degrees above zero. Randy sealed the berth entrance with the wool blanket curtain, lay flat on the sedge mat with her full bedding arrangement. Blanket, coat, mittens, wool cap pulled low, and waited. The outer cavity read 17 degrees, 11 degrees warmer than outside. The tree's mass and the baffle system slowed the wind enough to account for the difference, but 17 degrees was still freezing. A person could not sleep at 17 degrees without eventually losing the battle between body heat and air temperature. After 1 hour inside the berth, with all 14 panels hung and the curtain sealed, the air around her body read 34 degrees. She added the wrapped fire brick, heated in the trench, placed in the iron kettle, swaddled in 2 layers of cloth. 39 degrees. Not warm. Not comfortable by any standard a person with a stove would recognize. But 39 degrees inside a space 30 inches wide and 36 inches high, insulated on all sides, with 1 child's body and 1 cooling brick, was 33 degrees warmer than the air outside the tree. Guro had told her the bedding mattered as much as the air temperature. The bedding trapped a layer of still air directly against Randy's skin. The berth trapped a second layer around the bedding. The tree trapped a third layer around the berth. 3 shells, each one slowing the passage of heat from the innermost source. Randy's 70 pounds of blood and muscle to the coldest sink, which was the January sky. The system worked the way her mother had described, not by heating the house, by heating the air next to the sleeper. Randy recorded the numbers. 6 degrees outside, 17 in the outer cavity, 34 in the berth, 39 with the brick. She fell asleep with the pencil still in her hand. By morning, frost coated the upper inner cloth. Her breath had condensed through the night, moisture rising from her mouth and nose, meeting the cold surface of the uppermost panel, and freezing into a white crust that reflected the gray dawn light coming through the knothole vent. She had sealed the berth too tightly. The horsehair screens and the knothole vent had not moved enough moist air out. The berth had retained heat, but also retained moisture, and the moisture had frozen on the coldest surface it could reach. If she left the frost, it would melt by midday, soak the panel, and reduce its insulating power. Within 3 nights, the cycle would destroy the cloth and the fiber inside it. She and Guro widened the upper vent path by shifting cloth around the knot opening, not by cutting the tree, but by pulling the panel edge back 1/2 inch and securing it with a peg. The next test was colder in raw temperature, but drier. The frost did not return. The fix cost roughly 2 degrees of warmth inside the berth. The math was relentless. Every improvement in one direction carried a cost in another. More ventilation meant less condensation, but more heat loss. More insulation meant more warmth, but more trapped moisture. The design was not a solution. It was a negotiation between physics, materials, and a child's body conducted in fractions of degrees. By January 11th, the shelter existed as a finished object for the first time. Floor complete, 10 inches above the cavity base, drainage path clear, inner sleeping berth complete. 14 panels hung, willow ribs holding, inner cloth layer intact, curtain functional, two-stage entrance baffle complete, outer curtain of doubled canvas, inner curtain of wool, dead air pocket between them measured 18 inches deep, high and low ventilation paths tested, moisture controlled, horsehair screens in place, 12 to 14 days of food cached, weekly ration arrangement with Guro established and functional through 4 successful exchanges, cooking trench operational, ember box intact, 2 fire bricks serviceable, no public proof that the shelter worked, no legal right to occupy the parcel, no adult in the township who believed a child could survive a Minnesota winter inside a tree. That night the air turned strangely mild. The temperature climbed to levels Randy associated with late March. Snow dripped from the roof of Bell's store. Water ran in the frozen ruts of the Medford Road. Cattle stood loose and calm in the fields, their breath barely visible. Randy watched from beside the kitchen stove and felt the wrongness in her stomach before she could name it. January did not warm like this. January warmed only when something large was moving through the atmosphere, a system pushing mild air ahead of itself the way a plow pushes dirt. The warm air was not the event, it was the warning. The next morning, 2 silver dollars vanished from Bell's store. January 12th, 1888, began with the sun. The snow softened. Children walked to school in open coats. Farmers who had stayed inside for a week stepped out to check fence lines and feed. The air felt wrong to anyone who had lived through enough winters to distrust a gift, but it felt wonderful to everyone else. The blizzard that was building northwest of the territory carried an Arctic air mass moving south and east at a speed that would close the distance between the horizon and the schoolhouse door in less time than a teacher could dismiss a class. Bell accused Randy before noon. The words were the same: thief, silver dollars, torn sewing box. But this time he did not call for Kittredge. He simply told her to leave. "If you are still on this road when the constable comes through," Bell said, "I will have you taken to Owatonna in chains." He did not believe in chains. He believed in the word, spoken in front of 2 customers and his eldest son. The word was enough. Randy was on the river road by 12:30. She carried her blanket, her sewing tin, her blunt knife, 1 mitten, and a wrapped fire brick she had heated on Bell's kitchen stove that morning before anyone woke. She had not known she would need it today. She heated it every morning. She had been heating it every morning since December. At approximately 2 o'clock, she entered the woods. At approximately 2:30, the sky disappeared. The front came as a wall. Not a gradual darkening, not a slow drop in temperature. A physical barrier of wind and snow that struck the tree line like a door slamming. The temperature plunged. The wind went from still to screaming in a span of minutes. The snow was not falling. It was horizontal, fine as flour, driven with enough force to blind and choke. Randy had tied a rope between 3 trees along the final 100 yards to the oak. She had tied it in October when the idea of needing a guide rope through the woods seemed cautious to the point of absurd. Now she could not see the tree from a distance of 10 feet. The rope was the only thing connecting her to the entrance. It vanished twice, buried by drifting snow. She dropped to her knees both times and swept the ground with her mittened hand until the frozen hemp met her fingers. She reached the oak with one cheek numb and the fingers of her left hand stiff past the point of pain. The outer baffle closed behind her. The bottom edge flapped against the threshold stones, a rhythmic slap that meant the wind was finding the gap between the canvas and the clay. She packed a rolled sedge mat against the base. The slapping stopped. The sound of the wind did not stop. It changed, from a direct assault to a deep, sustained moan that came through the wood of the trunk itself, as though the tree were translating the storm into a frequency her bones could hear. She crawled into the sleeping berth. She did not undress. She pulled every layer of bedding over her body, blanket, coat, wool cap, the second mitten she kept inside the berth, and lay on her side with her knees drawn up. She ate one spoonful of lard mixed with cornmeal. The fat hit her stomach, and she felt her body seize on the calories the way a fire seizes on kindling. She placed the wrapped fire brick inside the iron kettle beside her hip. She waited. The first hour was fear. The second was cold. By the fourth hour, the cold had become a physical pressure, not pain, but weight, as though the air itself were leaning on her chest. Then the low ventilation gap clogged. Wind-driven powder, fine as dust, had packed into the gap between the baffle base and the lower screen. The air inside the berth went still. Not peaceful still, dead still. The kind of stillness that meant nothing was moving, not fresh air in, not stale air out. Randy felt it before she measured it. Her breathing grew heavy, not labored, heavy, as though each breath required a decision. The moisture from her lungs had nowhere to go. It hung in the tiny space like fog. She had to leave the berth. She pushed the wool curtain aside, crawled into the outer cavity where the temperature was below freezing and the baffle edge still shuddered, and found the lower vent by feel. She cleared it with a willow rod, pushing packed powder out through the horsehair screen until cold air rushed in and hit her face like a slap. The air hurt, but it moved. She crawled back into the berth and sealed the curtain. The ventilation resumed. The fog in her breathing space thinned. The cost was a drop in temperature she could feel immediately, the outer cold pouring through the cleared gap, mixing with the air the berth had spent 4 hours warming. The math started over, her body against the dark, the brick cooling, the wind still screaming. If you are invested in Randy's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because the shelter now has to survive the one failure she cannot repair from outside. In the 6th hour, a sound came from above. Not the wind, not the groaning she had learned to ignore. A sharp, fibrous crack, the sound of living wood splitting under lateral load. An upper limb had broken or was breaking. The trunk shuddered. Randy felt it through the floor, through the sedge mat, through the poles and stones beneath her. The old scar, the vertical channel where lightning damage ran from the high branch to the root crown. If the scar opened, if the weakened wood along that channel split under the pressure of wind and ice loading, the cavity would be exposed directly to the storm, the baffles, the berth, the panels, the entire nested system of insulation would become irrelevant. She would be lying inside an open wound in a tree in the middle of the worst blizzard in the territory's memory. Randy moved her bedding to the root flare side. Guro had placed the berth here for exactly this reason. The thickest wood, the deepest roots, the last part of the tree that would fail. She looped a rope around the inner diagonal brace so she could feel any movement in the darkness. If the brace shifted, the interior shelf was collapsing. If the shelf collapsed, she had seconds to reach the entrance. The brace held. The groaning continued. Deep, irregular. The sound of a 200-year-old organism resisting forces it could feel but could not flee. Randy pressed her face against the inner panel and counted her heartbeats because counting was the only thing she could control. At midnight, the second entrance curtain tore loose from one peg. The wind found the gap instantly. Snow, not flakes but powder, dry as sand, sharp as ground glass, blew into the outer cavity and began filling the space between the baffles. Within minutes, the foot of the cavity was covered. The dead air pocket that separated the outer world from the inner berth was gone. Randy crawled out again. The cold in the outer cavity hit her like water. She found the curtain by feel, one edge still pegged, the other whipping against the wall, and worked her sewing awl through the frozen canvas to make a new hole for the peg. Her left wrist failed. The weak joint, damaged in the fall carrying Belle's water bucket, refused to hold the awl steady against the force of the wind pulling the curtain. She dropped the awl, found it in the snow by sweeping her bare hand across the ground, tried again, failed again. She held the awl between her teeth and used her right hand to drive the peg through the new hole. The curtain caught. The snow in the outer cavity began to settle. The dead air pocket reformed, degraded, imperfect but functional. She crawled back into the berth with snow in her hair and her left hand shaking beyond control. She tucked both hands between her thighs and curled until the shaking slowed to tremors, and the tremors slowed to something she could almost ignore. The fire brick had gone cold. She had no way to reheat it. The cooking trench was 8 feet from the tree, and the fire was out, and the storm was between her and the ember box. Her body was the only heat source left. Dawn came as a lightening of the dark inside the knothole vent. Not sunrise, not warmth, just a shift from black to gray that meant the earth had continued turning, even through the hours when Randy was not certain it would. The wind had not stopped, but it had changed direction. The gusts came in surges now, instead of a sustained wall. Between surges, she heard something she had not heard all night. Silence. Brief pockets of nothing, lasting 2 or 3 seconds before the next gust hit. She checked the outer cavity. The jar of water she kept on the shelf had frozen solid. The ice was white and opaque, frozen fast enough that air bubbles had been trapped inside. She checked the smaller cup she kept beneath her blankets, tucked against her stomach, a skin of ice on top, liquid water beneath. She held the cup in both hands and felt the difference between the two objects, one frozen through, one still partly alive, and understood what the numbers in her ledger would later confirm. The outer cavity had dropped well below freezing. The inner berth had dropped too, but the nested layers, tree, baffle, berth wall, bedding, body, had slowed the heat loss enough that water against her skin remained liquid through the worst night in the territory's memory. The tree had not become warm. The tree had become slow, and slow was enough. Beyond the oak, the blizzard had done what blizzards did. Eben Cole, a hired hand on the Bell farm, had attempted to cross from the livestock shed to the farmhouse, a distance of perhaps 90 yards. At roughly the same hour, Randy was clearing her ventilation gap. He lost direction within 30 steps. The snow erased the shed behind him and the house ahead. He crawled until his hand struck the runner of an overturned feed sled, pulled himself beneath it, and lay in the narrow space between the sled and the frozen ground until morning. He survived. His left hand did not. The doctor in Owatonna removed 3 fingers 2 weeks later. One of Bell's draft horses died in the main shed after a door tore loose from its upper hinge and swung open for 5 hours. The horse was found standing, frozen in position, its body having given up heat faster than its heart could produce it in a space too large and too open to defend. The contrast was not heroic. Randy was not stronger than Eben Cole or smarter than a draft horse. She had identified a specific problem: the rate at which an oversized space surrendered heat to moving air, and she had built a specific countermeasure before the event that tested it. Eben Cole had not imagined needing to cross 90 yards in zero visibility. The horse had not chosen its shelter. Preparation was not courage. Preparation was measurement applied before the deadline arrived. Guro had tried to reach the oak during the first afternoon of the storm. She made it 200 yards past her own fence before the visibility closed to nothing. She turned back, following her own tracks until the wind erased them, and she finished the return by feel, one hand on the wire, her eyes shut against snow that cut like metal filings. The next morning, she followed the tree line with a rope around her waist, moving from trunk to trunk, testing each step before committing her weight. It took her 90 minutes to cover the distance she normally walked in 40. She found the entrance baffle intact but crusted with ice. She pulled it aside and called Randy's name. No answer. She called again. A sound from inside the berth. Not words. A vibration. The sound a body makes when it has been shaking for so long that speech requires energy it has already spent. Guro entered the cavity. She pulled the berth curtain aside and found Randy curled on the root flare side, blankets tight, face gray, left fingers pale in a way that made Guro's breath catch. She did not praise the shelter. She did not say Randy had survived. She warmed the child gradually, rubbing circulation into the fingers, checking the color return, listening to Randy's breathing for the crackling that would mean fluid in the lungs. Then she looked at the inner panels. Dry. After 14 hours of occupation, after a blizzard that had killed livestock and maimed a grown man and driven temperatures to levels that cracked fence posts, the stitched cloth panels that Randy had sewn from grain sacks and cattail fiber, hung on willow ribs inside a hollow tree, were dry. The frost from her breath had formed on the upper cloth, the venting surface, but had not penetrated the insulation layer. The design had managed the moisture, not perfectly, not the way a heated cabin managed it, but well enough that the material still functioned. Guro said nothing for a long time. She sat beside Randy in the berth, her back against the root flare, and held the child's damaged hand between both of her own. Then she said, "Show me the numbers." Randy pointed to the scrap of brown paper tucked behind the 10th panel. Guro read the overnight entries in the dim light. Outside temperature, cavity temperature, berth temperature. Timestamps marked in shaking handwriting that deteriorated through the night until the final entry was barely legible. She folded the paper and put it in her coat. "We will need a proper ledger," she said. Randy had survived the blizzard. No one beyond Guro knew. The oak stood, the berth held. The ventilation had clogged and been cleared. The curtain had torn and been repaired. The upper scar had groaned and cracked but had not opened. The sleeping berth had maintained a temperature difference that kept water liquid against skin while water froze solid 4 feet away. But survival was not resolution. Returning to Bell meant surrendering the theft narrative. Randy would re-enter the household as a proven thief, stripped of whatever small protections the placement agreement once provided. Bell would control the story. She would carry the word incorrigible into the state school's records, where it would follow her through every future placement until she turned 18 and was released with nothing. Remaining hidden meant 80 more days of winter. Her independent food supply covered 12. Guro's weekly deliveries could sustain her, but Guro was 57 years old, arthritic, indebted, and had nearly died crossing an open field the previous afternoon. And there was something else. When Guro left the tree that morning, she stopped at the entrance and ran her hand along the exterior bark. Fresh axe marks. 3 of them. Recent. The exposed wood still pale, not yet darkened by air or rain. Someone had tested the trunk with a blade. Someone had checked whether the tree was worth cutting. Bell's crew was not scheduled to reach this section of the parcel until late January. But someone had walked here during the storm's approach, or immediately after, and struck the living bark of the giant oak 3 times. Guro looked at Randy. Randy looked at the axe marks. Neither of them spoke. The blizzard was over. The slower emergency, hunger, discovery, and the question of who owned a hollow tree and the child inside it had just begun. The morning after Guro found her, Randy ate the first full meal she had allowed herself in 11 days. Cornmeal mush with lard, dried apple, a strip of salt pork heated on a stone beside the cooking trench. She ate sitting on the stool Guro had carried to the tree in November, wrapped in every layer she owned, while the January sky hung low and white above the slough, and the wind moved through the oaks with the exhausted indifference of a storm that had finished its work and no longer cared what it had done. She did not rest. She could not afford to rest. 80 days of winter remained between her and the ground thaw that would end the killing season, and the blizzard had solved nothing except the question of whether the birth could keep her alive for one night. One night was not a winter. One night was an audition. The hidden winter settled into arithmetic. Guro brought staples every 7 to 10 days: cornmeal, potatoes, dried beans, small amounts of salt pork or lard, lamp wick for the times when Randy needed to inspect the panels after dark, clean cloth for the cut on her right palm, which healed slowly in the cold and reopened twice before the skin finally sealed in February. Randy paid for every delivery. She stitched 6 grain sacks for Guro's spring seed storage. She sorted and tied 400 bundles of dried herbs: boneset, yarrow, chamomile, horehound, materials Guro used in her midwife work and could not prepare with arthritic fingers. She snared 11 rabbits along the slough between January and March, skinning each one, stretching the hides on willow frames, and delivering the pelts to Guro's kitchen along with the cleaned meat. The ledger tracked everything. Randy had begun it on a scrap of brown paper. By February, she used a proper notebook Guro provided, the same type her husband had used to record barrel measurements and wood stock. Every ounce received, every task completed, every temperature reading, morning and evening, every repair to the panels, the baffle, the floor. Every day the drainage channel needed clearing. Every day it did not. The ledger was not bookkeeping. It was evidence. If Bell or anyone else later claimed that Randy had survived on stolen goods, the ledger would show the economy she had built: labor exchanged for food, skill traded for material, every transaction visible and accounted for in a child's careful handwriting. She established routines that governed the shelter the way Bell's store hours governed his day: airbedding each dry morning by draping blankets over the entrance frame, remove frost from the upper cloth before it melted and soaked the panel, inspect the trunk after every windstorm, press her palm against the sapwood, tap with the knife handle, listen, burn no flame inside, keep food suspended in covered containers so mice could not reach it. Store 1 week's emergency ration untouched in a sealed tin. Melt snow and cook outside whenever conditions allowed. The routines were not rituals. They were maintenance, the daily labor of keeping a fragile system functional in an environment that tested every joint, every seam, and every material choice with relentless physical force. By early April, the shelter contained objects that no one in Medford expected to find inside a hollow tree: a dry raised floor, a fitted sleeping berth with 14 insulation panels, each one patched at least once, 2 shelves built from split willow and pegged into the dead heartwood, a covered pantry basket hanging from a cord, a wash basin made from a cracked enamel bowl Guro no longer used, a peg rail for clothing. Randy now owned 2 dresses, one scavenged from a Cran's rag pile, a repaired stool, rabbit pelt foot covering stitched from the hide she had not traded, a numbered food ledger with 91 entries, a small polished mirror Guro had placed on the upper shelf one afternoon without explanation. The phrase living like a queen was visual irony, not wealth, not luxury. Compared with the filthy death scene the town expected, a frozen child curled in a rotting trunk, the oak was clean, ordered, and managed with the kind of attention that implied intelligence rather than desperation. The contrast was the point. The people who had called her Oak Queen as mockery had imagined squalor. What existed inside the tree was closer to a ship's cabin, tight, purposeful, and built to function under conditions that would destroy anything designed for comfort. Perpuenonbuer, Bell sent 4 men to cut damaged oak for cordwood in the second week of April. The crew worked north along the river, felling storm-broken trunks and bucking them into 4-foot lengths. They reached the slough by mid-morning. The giant oak was visible from 50 yards, the largest trunk on the parcel, scarred but standing, surrounded by deadfall that the blizzard had shaken loose from neighboring trees. A man named Harstad heard the sound first. He stopped his cross-cut saw and held up one hand. The other 3 men went quiet. Singing, or coughing, or both, a thin sound coming from inside the massive trunk, muffled by the baffle curtains but audible in the still morning air. Harstad set down his saw. He walked to the entrance. He pulled back the outer canvas and looked inside. Later he told his wife what he had expected to find. A dead animal, maybe a vagrant, maybe nothing. Maybe the wind moving through the cavity had produced a sound that his tired ears had shaped into a human voice. What he found was a girl seated on a stool, writing the morning temperature into a numbered ledger, with a wash basin at her feet and a row of dried herb bundles hanging from pegs above her head. Harstad did not speak for a long time. He stood in the entrance with the canvas pulled back and cold April air pouring in around him, and he looked at the sleeping berth, the shelves, the pantry basket, the repaired stool, the 14 patched panels that line the interior like the quilted walls of a room that happened to be inside a tree. He had expected bones. He found shelves. The 3 other men crowded behind him. One of them, a Swede named Lindahl, said a single word under his breath that Harstad's wife later reported but could not translate. The validation came in layers, each one louder than the last. Randy showed her records first. She opened the ledger to the blizzard entry, January 12th, and read the numbers aloud. Outer cavity temperature, berth temperature, timestamps. Vent clearing at the 4th hour. Curtain repair at midnight. Dawn reading. The cup of water that had remained liquid beneath her blankets while the jar on the shelf froze solid. Harstad listened. He was not a builder or an engineer. He was a man who cut wood for a living and understood cold the way anyone who worked outside in Minnesota understood it, not theoretically, but physically, in his joints and his scars, and the memory of mornings when his saw blade stuck to his gloves. He asked one question. The panels stayed dry? Randy pulled the nearest panel from its peg and handed it to him. He pressed it between his palms. Dry. Resilient. The cattail fiber inside crinkled faintly, the sound of material that had not absorbed moisture. He handed it back without comment. His face said what his mouth did not. The crew foreman, a man named Dahl, who reported directly to Bell, confirmed what he had seen. The snow that had entered during the blizzard had filled only the outer section of the cavity, the space between the 2 baffles. The inner cavity was clear. The sleeping berth was dry. The floor showed no standing water. The drainage channel had functioned. Dahl wrote a single line in his own work log. Found the Moen girl alive inside the big oak. Shelter in good order. Ruth came 3 days later. She walked from the Krantz farm in the late afternoon, following the path Randi had worn through the slough. She did not bring food or gifts. She brought herself, which was harder. She stood inside the cavity and looked at everything Randy had built since October. The things Ruth had contributed to, with one torn grain sack and a whispered warning about Belle's son, and the things she had not contributed to because her father's credit line did not permit association with a girl branded a thief. She touched the panels. She tested the floor with her boot. She bent and looked into the sleeping berth, 30 inches by 66 inches by 36 inches, small enough that a child's elbows touched both walls. She said, "I was right that you could not eat the walls." Randy waited. "I was wrong about what the walls bought you," Ruth said. "What did they buy?" Randy asked, not because she did not know, because she needed Ruth to say it. "Time," Ruth said. "Lower fuel demand, protection from wind." She paused. "The ability to wait for help instead of dying while you waited." Ruth did not apologize for the months of public silence. Randy did not ask her to. They stood in the oak while the April light came through the knot-hole vent and made a bright circle on the far wall, and both of them understood that the debt between them was complicated and would remain so. Ruth became the first peer to acknowledge what Randy had done without pretending that the oak solved every problem. The walls did not create food. The berth did not replace a stove. The shelter bought time, hours, days, weeks of survivable conditions inside a space that would have killed her without modification. Time was not everything. But without time, everything else was irrelevant. Kittredge arrived on the first warm day in April. He came alone, on foot, wearing his constable's coat, and carrying a folding rule he used for road measurements. He did not greet Randy. He walked past her, entered the cavity, and began measuring. He measured the entrance opening, the baffled depth, the distance from the outer curtain to the inner curtain, the floor height, the berth dimensions, the panel thickness, the vent opening, the drainage channel depth and slope. He unfolded his rule against the sapwood and checked the wall thickness at 3 points around the cavity. He spent 40 minutes inside the tree. When he came out, he sat on a fallen log and said nothing for a long time. Randy stood near the cooking trench with her arms crossed. She had prepared for this moment, for the constable who had called the tree a coffin to see what the coffin had become. And now that it was happening, she felt nothing she had expected. Not triumph, not vindication, just fatigue, and a desire for him to say whatever he was going to say so she could go back to her routines. "I called it a coffin," Kittredge said. "You built a storm room inside it." Randy said, "I built a sleeping berth inside it. The tree was already the storm room." Kittredge looked at her. He was not a man who admitted error easily. 20 winters and a war had made him confident in his judgments, and confident men did not reverse themselves without physical proof strong enough to override their experience. He had the proof, the measurements, the dry panels, the ledger entries, the living child standing in front of him, 15 pounds lighter than she had been in October, but standing. "I assumed you would ignore the risks," he said. "The structural weakness, the fire, the moisture. I assumed a child would not think about those things." "I did not think about them," Randy said. "Not at first. Guru Stensland made me think about them." "Stensland," Kittredge repeated. He knew the name. Everyone knew the name. "She taught me how to check the wood, where to sleep if the scar opens, how to keep the insulation dry, why fire cannot enter the tree." Kittredge folded his rule and put it in his coat. "I would not call every hollow tree safe," he said. "I would not tell a family to move into the woods." "Neither would I," Randy said. He nodded. It was the closest thing to respect he had given her since the day he told her to come back to Owatonna. He compared the berth to Belle's livestock shed, the shed that had lost a door, that had killed a horse, that had cost Aben Cole 3 fingers. The shed was larger. The shed had a stove. The shed had been built by adults with money and tools. And the shed had failed because it was too large to hold heat, too poorly sealed to resist wind, and too carelessly maintained to survive a storm that tested every joint. The berth was smaller than a coffin, and it had held. Within 2 weeks, families from 3 neighboring farms asked whether they should move into hollow trees. Randy refused the question. She explained, standing in the cavity with visitors crouching through the entrance one at a time, that the tree was not the method. The tree was one application of a set of principles that could be applied to any structure. She listed them. She had written them on a board Guro had planed smooth and hung inside the entrance. Stop direct wind. Raise the sleeper from wet ground. Reduce the volume of the space that must be warmed. Keep fibrous insulation dry and enclosed. Vent moisture from breathing. Separate flame from all insulation. Inspect the supporting structure. 7 rules. Each one learned through failure, corrected through measurement, and tested against the worst night in the territory's recorded weather. Belle's response came before the week ended. He arrived at the tree with Dahl and one of the store clerks. He did not look at the berth. He did not examine the panels. He walked through the cavity, noted the shelves, the food stores, the tools, and said that everything inside the tree belonged to him. This girl was under indenture to my household, Belle said. Her labor is my property. What her labor produced is my property. The food, the tools, the berth, the canvas, all of it. Guro stepped forward. She had been standing outside the entrance beyond the fire line, waiting for this moment the way a person waits for weather they can see coming. She produced the ledger. I supplied the cornmeal, she said. She pointed to the entry. I supplied the beans, the potatoes, the lard, the lampwick, the cloth. Each item had a date, a weight, and a corresponding labor entry beside it. Randy paid for every ounce with sewing, herb work, and rabbit pelts. The accounts are balanced. Ruth's father, who had followed the commotion from the road, confirmed that the grain sacks were mill discards, torn, unrecorded, and valueless in the mill's inventory. Kittredge, who had returned when he heard Belle's voice carrying through the woods, checked Belle's cutting agreement. The agreement authorized removal of damaged oak and deadfall. The giant bur oak was neither. It was a living tree, scarred but standing, and Belle had no more right to its interior than he had to the interior of a neighbor's barn. Belle looked at the ledger. He looked at Kittredge. He looked at the faces of the people who had gathered. Harstad, Lindell, 2 farm wives, a teenage boy from the school, and he saw in those faces something he had not expected. Not anger, not accusation, curiosity. They wanted to see the tree. They wanted to understand what Randy had built. And Belle was standing between them and the entrance, like a man blocking a doorway he did not own. He left without speaking. A county placement agent arrived from Owatonna 3 days later and opened an inquiry into Belle's treatment of Randy during her indenture. The inquiry did not produce charges. It produced something more useful, a formal review that placed Belle's records next to Guro's ledger and let the numbers speak. Guro petitioned the probate court to become Randy's legal guardian. The parcel owner, a Faribault farmer who had never visited the flood-prone strip, agreed to sell Guro 5 acres at the slough for $27, payable partly through labor. The property would be held in trust for Randy until she reached adulthood. Belle produced a witness, a hired man named Corwin, who claimed Randy had confessed to the theft of the $2 silver. The claim hung in the air like smoke, unresolved, poisoning every conversation about the oak and the girl who had lived inside it. See, the theft accusation collapsed in June. Bell's son, Alton, was called before the county agent to confirm his father's account. He had rehearsed the story, the torn sewing box, the hidden coins, the girl's silence when accused. But under questioning, he contradicted himself on the date. He said the money vanished on a Tuesday. Bell's original complaint said Thursday. The discrepancy was small, but the agent pressed it, and Alton's second answer contradicted his first. Ruth had waited 3 months to speak. She had weighed the cost, her father's credit, her family's standing, the risk of calling a storekeeper's son a liar in a community that depended on the storekeeper's goods. She told the agent she had seen Alton tear the lining of Randy's sewing box. She had seen him do it 2 days before the accusation. She had not seen him place the coins, but she had seen him create the evidence that made the accusation look real. The final proof came from the Clinton Falls Mill. One of the marked silver dollars appeared in a debt payment Alton had made for harness leather. The mill clerk's receipt matched the date and the coin's condition. The court could not prove Orson Bell had ordered his son to frame Randy. The evidence pointed to Alton acting alone, motivated by resentment toward a girl who slept beside his kitchen stove and occupied attention he considered his. But the court terminated Bell's authority over Randy's placement, removed the theft notation from her record, and placed her formally under Guro's guardianship. Bell lost his easiest weapon, the word thief, no longer attached to Randy's name. Without it, he was a storekeeper who had expelled a 12-year-old into a blizzard. The community did not say this aloud. They said it with their feet, walking past his store to the oak, where a child had built something they wanted to understand. Randy and Guro stopped treating the oak as a design. They treated it as a proof, evidence that the 7 principles worked, and began adapting the method for structures that ordinary families already owned. The sleeping closet came first, a child-sized curtained berth built against an interior cabin wall, using stitched sedge and wool panels identical to the ones in the oak. A family with a drafty cabin and insufficient firewood could reduce the volume their children needed to warm at night by 80%. The closet cost nothing except labor and materials that grew in every slough within walking distance. The storm cabinet followed, a reinforced inner box built inside a root cellar or pantry, large enough for 2 adults, lined with dry panels, raised on stones, ventilated through a screen pipe. Families who could not heat their homes through a multi-day storm could retreat to the cabinet with food and blankets and survive on body heat and a single wrapped brick. The wind vestibule was simplest, a double curtain entry for any exterior door. 2 layers of heavy fabric hung 18 inches apart, creating a dead air pocket that reduced direct wind infiltration without sealing the room airtight. It worked on the same principle as the oak's baffle system, scaled to a standard doorway. Every design carried Randy's insistence on moisture control and fire separation, dry fiber only, enclosed panels, not loose fill, no open flame near the insulation, a vent path for breath moisture, an inspection schedule. She taught the methods to girls from nearby farms. Not because girls were the only audience, but because girls were the ones who managed bedding, repaired cloth, and made decisions about where children slept. She made each learner perform 3 tests: weigh a dry bundle and a wet bundle by hand. Feel the difference. Hold a candle near base, but never beneath. A fiber sample outdoors, with water ready. Watch how fast the material caught. Understand what that speed meant inside a closed space. Lie inside a full-sized room and then inside the small berth. Feel the moving air in the room. Feel the still air in the berth. Understand that the difference between those two sensations was the difference between losing heat and keeping it. In the years between the blizzard and the winter of 1893, Guro and Randy built 11 storm cabinets together. Each one was different. Each one taught Randy something the oak had not. A cabinet in a stone cellar needed different moisture management than one in a timber frame pantry. A cabinet for a family of 6 required thicker panels and a larger vent than one for a widow living alone. A cabinet built against an exterior wall lost heat faster than one surrounded by interior mass. Guro's backstory emerged during these projects, not in confessions or long conversations, but in the small remarks that physical work loosened from a person's memory. Her husband, Eric, had built his first root cellar at 19 on a homestead near Rushford that flooded every spring. He had learned to raise everything, food, tools, bedding, above the waterline, and to treat moisture not as an occasional problem, but as the permanent condition of life near a river. Guro had worked beside him for 23 years, holding staves while he bent them, mixing mortar for the cellar walls, cutting and fitting barrel hoops that had to withstand pressure from the inside without splitting. She missed his hands more than his voice. She said this once while planing a shelf for the 9th cabinet and did not say it again. They disagreed about ventilation in the 10th cabinet. Guro wanted a single high vent, arguing that simplicity reduced the chance of a blocked path. Randy wanted a high and low system, arguing that the dual path allowed convective flow, warm air rising out through the top, cold air entering through the bottom, and that a single vent relied entirely on diffusion, which was slower and less reliable in still conditions. They built one of each and tested them on the same night. Randy's dual system removed more moisture. Guro's single vent retained more heat. Neither was wrong. The correct answer depended on whether the family's greater danger was dampness or cold, and that depended on the structure, the climate, and the number of bodies inside. Guro conceded the technical point. Randy conceded that simplicity mattered for families who would not maintain a complex system. They compromised on a dual vent with a closable lower gap, adjustable by the occupant, defaulting to open. It was the last design they completed together. In the winter of 1893, Guro contracted pneumonia after a difficult midwife journey. The call had come from a farm 9 miles north, past the Straight River crossing, in weather that an older woman with arthritic joints and diminished lung capacity should not have traveled through. She went because the alternative was a 17-year-old mother delivering her first child alone, and Guro had spent 40 years making certain that no woman in her reach delivered alone if she could prevent it. She reached the farm. She delivered the child. She walked the 9 miles back in wet boots and a coat that had soaked through during the river crossing. The fever began 2 days later. Randy found her in bed, breathing in shallow pulls that sounded like cloth tearing slowly. Randy moved into Guro's house. She heated bricks. She boiled water for steam. She propped Guro upright against pillows, because lying flat made the breathing worse. She sent word to the doctor in Owatonna, who came, examined Guro, prescribed rest and warmth, the same prescription he gave every pneumonia patient because no better tools existed, and left. Guro's last fully conscious conversation happened on the 4th evening. Randy sat beside the bed, holding a cup of broth Guro could not drink. Guro did not talk about the oak. She did not talk about the blizzard, or the birth, or the 11 cabinets, or the 7 rules painted on the board inside the entrance. She said, "Keep the principle, change the shape." Randy waited for more. "Every structure fails," Guro said. "Wood rots, stone shifts, the river moves. If you love the shape more than the principle, you will defend the shape after it stops working. She coughed, a deep, liquid sound that made Randy's hands tighten on the cup. The shape is temporary. The principle is what transfers. She closed her eyes. She did not open them again in the way that meant conversation. She opened them twice more over the following 2 days. Brief, unfocused moments when Randy spoke to her and could not tell whether Guro heard. And then she did not open them at all. Guro Stensland died on a Thursday morning in February, with the temperature at 4 degrees below zero, and the wind moving across her roof in the same sustained moan that Randy had heard inside the oak 5 years earlier. She left Randy her cooper's tools, her temperature notebook, and the guardianship interest in the 5-acre parcel beside the slough. The mirror stayed on the shelf inside the tree. Randy did not move it. She did not explain why. Some losses do not change what a person does. They change the silence around the doing, the absence of the voice that once checked the work, corrected the measurement, and said, "Cold is honest," while hanging wet moss in the dark. The Straight River flooded in the spring of 1894. Rapid thaw after a heavy snow winter broke the river ice into slabs that jammed at every bend. Water backed up behind the jams, overtopped the banks, and spread across the low ground on both sides. The 5-acre parcel sat in the flood path. Water reached the oak on the second day, entering the lower entrance and rising across the cavity floor. The drainage channel that had kept snowmelt at bay was useless against a river. Within hours, the floor was submerged. The sedge mats floated free. Water touched the lower edge of the sleeping berth panels and began wicking upward through the stitching. Randy could have defended the tree. She could have sandbagged the entrance, pumped water, raised the floor again. She had the materials and the knowledge and 5 years of emotional investment in the structure that had saved her life. She removed the bedding. She removed the panels. She removed the food, the tools, the ledger, and the mirror. She carried everything to higher ground and stacked it beneath a tarp. Then she walked to the 3 neighboring farms where she had built storm cabinets the previous year. Each cabinet stood on raised stone piers with ventilated floors. The same principle Guro had insisted on for the oak applied to structures that sat in basements and cellars instead of tree cavities. Randy checked each one. Dry inside. The piers held the cabinets above the rising water table. The ventilated floors allowed moisture to escape downward instead of pooling. Guro's medicine chest, her remaining seed stock, 4 families' worth of grain sacks, and 18 blankets survived the flood inside the elevated cabinets. Bell's conventional ground-level cordwood shed lost most of its dry stock. The wood sat directly on the earth floor. When the water came, it soaked from the bottom up. By the time the river receded, 3 cords of seasoned oak had absorbed enough moisture to be useless as fuel until midsummer. Randy stood at the edge of the slough and looked at the oak. Water ran through the entrance. The interior she had built over 5 years, the floor, the frame, the shelves, the peg rail, was underwater. The tree had not failed structurally. The trunk held. The sapwood lived. But the shelter inside it had met a threat it was not designed for, and the correct response was not loyalty. It was evacuation. Keep the principle. Change the shape. She had preserved the principle. Elevation, dryness, ventilation, structural inspection, and changed the shape from a tree cavity to a set of freestanding cabinets. The cabinets worked where the oak did not because they were designed for a different threat. The oak had been designed against wind and cold. The flood was neither. A shelter built for winter could not be forced to survive spring by a builder who refused to let it go. If this story reminds you that preparation is knowledge, not fear, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Bell saw the opportunity in Randy's growing reputation and began selling what he called storm boxes, crude copies of the sleeping cabinet, packed with damp straw instead of dry enclosed fiber, lacking ventilation paths, and sealed with pitch that trapped moisture inside. One family installed a Bell box in their cellar in the autumn of 1894. By December, the interior was coated with black mold. Frost formed on the inner walls every night because the occupant's breath had no escape path. The straw, already damp at installation, had become a sodden mass that conducted cold instead of slowing it. The family's youngest child developed a cough that lasted 6 weeks. Randy examined the box. She ran her hand along the inner wall, and her fingers came away wet and dark. She pulled a handful of straw from the panel and squeezed it. Water dripped onto the cellar floor. She went to Bell's store the following morning. She did not go privately. She went when the store was full, 3 customers at the counter, 2 men by the stove, Ruth's father waiting for a harness repair. She placed the wet straw on the counter beside the register. "This is from your storm box," Randy said. "It is wet. Wet insulation conducts cold. The family's child has been coughing for 6 weeks. There is no ventilation. The moisture from their breathing is trapped inside the panels." Bell looked at the straw. He looked at the customers. "You do not have authority to inspect my products," he said. "I do not need authority," Randy said. "I need the family to stop sleeping inside a box that is making their child sick." She listed the failures. No enclosed fiber. Loose straw was not stitched into panels and could not be dried or replaced without dismantling the structure. No ventilation. The pitch seal trapped every breath. No raised floor. The box sat directly on a cellar floor that wicked groundwater. No inspection access. The pitch seal could not be opened without destroying it. Bell said nothing. Randy left the wet straw on the counter and walked out. Within a week, 2 other families who had purchased Bell's boxes asked Randy to inspect them. Both showed the same failures: a damp fill, no vent, no raised floor. Randy replaced the straw with dry enclosed panels, added screen vent openings, and raised each box on stone piers. She charged the families who could pay and accepted mending work from those who could not. Bell stopped selling the boxes. He did not announce this. The boxes simply disappeared from the items he offered. The straw stain remained on his counter for a month before someone scrubbed it away. But the damage to his authority was deeper than a stain. He had sold a product under the name of a method he did not understand, and the product had failed in the precise ways Randy's 7 rules were designed to prevent. Every family who had seen the wet straw on the counter understood something they had not understood before. Bell sold things. Randy built them. The distinction would matter more in the years ahead, when the question was no longer whether the method worked, but who had the right to teach it. Bell did not disappear after the straw incident. He adjusted. He stopped selling storm boxes. He stopped mentioning Randy's name in his store. He paid his debts carefully, kept his credit lines open, and waited for the community's attention to move on to the next difficulty. A poor harvest, a disputed fence line, a new preacher with new opinions. He understood that small towns had short memories for everything except money. What he did not understand was that Randy had changed the subject. The question was no longer whether a child could survive a winter in a tree. The question was whether the method worked. And the method had evidence: ledger entries, temperature records, 11 functioning cabinets, and the testimony of families who had used them during the hard freeze of 1895 without losing a single night of sleep. Bell's remaining weapon was doubt. He could not disprove the method, but he could argue that his version was equivalent. Cheaper materials, simpler construction. No need for the elaborate panel stitching and vent systems that Randy insisted on. If his box worked nearly as well, the extra labor was wasted. Randy did not argue. She organized. In November of 1895, she set up a public cold weather comparison on the open ground behind the Clinton Falls Mill. Two structures, side by side, identical exterior dimensions, identical exposure to wind. Bell's box used a single wall of rough sawn board, loose damp straw packed between the boards, no separated ventilation path, and an interior lantern for warmth and light. Randy's cabinet used two cloth skins separated by 4 inches of dry enclosed cattail fiber stitched into removable panels, a controlled high vent screened with horsehair, a closable low vent for fresh air intake, a raised floor on stone piers, and no exposed flame of any kind. She placed a mercury thermometer and a weighed square of dry muslin inside each structure at sunset. No occupants. The test would measure air temperature and moisture accumulation across a single November night with the ambient temperature expected to drop below 20 degrees. 14 people watched her set the thermometers. Bell stood among them with his arms folded and his jaw set. By morning, the results were legible before anyone read the instruments. Bell's box had accumulated visible condensation on every interior surface. The muslin square was damp, heavier by touch, darker in color, cold against the skin. The interior lantern had overheated the straw nearest its base, leaving a brown scorch mark on the panel where dry stalks had begun to char before the flame guttered out from insufficient oxygen. The temperature inside was marginally warmer than outside, but the moisture meant that any bedding placed inside the box would have been wet by dawn. Randy's cabinet was dry. The muslin square had gained no detectable weight. The interior temperature was lower than Bell's. The absence of a lantern meant no artificial heat source. But the panels were dry, the air moved freely through the vent path, and nothing inside had scorched, dampened, or degraded. Kittredge examined both structures. He pressed his hand against the interior walls of each. He lifted the muslin squares and weighed them against each other in his palms. He ordered Bell's box dismantled on the spot. "The lantern makes it a fire," Kittredge said. "The straw makes it fuel. I will not have a public hazard standing on mill property." Bell watched 2 mill hands pull the boards apart. The damp straw fell in clumps. The scorch mark was visible to everyone present. He did not leave. He stood and watched until the last board was stacked and the straw was raked into a pile. Then he said, "Your box is better." Randy looked at him. She had waited 7 years for something from this man, an apology, an acknowledgement, a reckoning for the night he sent a 12-year-old into a blizzard with 1 mitten and a word that followed her like a scar. She did not get it. "It is not a box," she said. "It is a set of rules." Bell heard the correction. He did not respond to it. He turned and walked toward his store. His back was straight. His hands were in his coat pockets. He looked like a man who had lost a negotiation he had expected to win, diminished but not broken, and already calculating what remained. He never apologized for the indenture. He never acknowledged the false theft accusation. He never admitted that his son had planted the coins. Circumstances stripped him of authority. The public test, the county inquiry, the community's slow migration of trust from his store counter to Randy's oak. But circumstances are not conscience. Bell lost power. He did not gain understanding. The distinction mattered. It meant Randy's victory was practical, not sentimental. She had not reformed her enemy. She had outlasted him. And outlasting, in a community where winter returned every year and the people who prepared survived, was the only verdict that held weight. Tolef Kavama arrived in the spring of 1896 to repair Guro's old barrels. He was 22, a cooper's apprentice from a shop in Northfield sent south to collect payment on a consignment of salt barrels that had warped during the previous winter's storage. The barrels had belonged to Guro's husband, Eric, and had passed to Randy through the guardianship estate. They sat in a lean-to behind the oak, still holding shape but needing new hoops and resealed staves. Tolef found Randy inside the tree, replacing a panel that had worn thin during the winter. He stopped in the entrance and looked at the berth, the shelves, the vent system, the raised floor. He looked at it the way a craftsman looks at another craftsman's work, not with admiration first, but with the question that craftsmen always ask before they admire. How does it fail? The cloth panels, he said. They sag after 2 seasons. The fiber compresses. The stitching rots where moisture finds a seam. Randy did not argue. He was right. Rigid wooden panels would hold their shape, he said. Tongue and groove, with the fiber packed between 2 thin boards. No stitching to rot, no sagging, a frame that keeps its dimensions for 20 years. Randy looked at him. She had heard this argument before, from herself in the early months, before Guro had explained why rigid panels created a different set of problems. You cannot inspect a sealed wooden panel, she said. If moisture enters through a crack or a failed joint, the fiber inside rots without warning. A cloth panel can be opened, dried, restuffed, and restitched in an afternoon. A wooden panel must be dismantled. Then the joints must be tight enough that moisture does not enter, Tolef said. No joint stays tight through 10 Minnesota winters, Randy said. Wood moves. Frost heaves the frame. Temperature changes open gaps that close in summer and reopen in December. The panel that looks sealed in August leaks in January. They argued for an hour. Randy standing inside the berth she had built at 12. Tolef standing in the entrance of a tree he had never seen before, holding a barrel hoop he had come to replace, telling a woman who had survived a blizzard in this cavity that her construction method was wrong. Neither of them yielded. They built one of each. Tolef's rigid panel used tongue and groove pine, 1/4-inch stock, with cattail fiber packed between the boards and sealed with beeswax at every joint. The craftsmanship was precise. The panel was beautiful, tight, smooth, architectural in a way that Randy's cloth and willow work had never been. Randy's cloth panel used the same design she had built since the beginning. Feed sack fabric, stitched seams, removable fiber. They installed both panels in the same cabinet, the 12th, built for a family near Clinton Falls, and tested them through the winter of 1896. By March, Randy's cloth panel had been opened, dried, and restuffed twice. It looked worn. It functioned. Tolef's rigid panel looked perfect. But when Randy pressed her palm against the interior surface in March, she felt dampness. She asked Tolef to open it. He resisted. The joints were tight. The beeswax was intact. The panel showed no visible failure. She waited. He opened it. The fiber inside had absorbed moisture through a hairline crack where the pine had shrunk during the coldest week of January. The crack was invisible from outside. The wax had resealed it when the wood expanded in the February thaw. But the damage was done. The inner fiber was damp, compressed, and beginning to smell of mildew. Tolef held the damp fiber in his hand and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "The frame is still better." Randy said, "The frame is better for structure. The cloth is better for maintenance. Use both." The final design combined Tulloch's rigid pine frame, which resisted crushing, held its shape, and provided structural support, with Randy's removable cloth panels, which slid into the frame like drawers and could be extracted, inspected, dried, and returned without dismantling anything. The design was better than either of them had built alone. It was better because it had been argued into existence by two people who respected each other's competence enough to test their disagreements with thermometers and weighed muslin instead of opinions. They worked as partners for 14 months before they married. During those months, they built 6 cabinets together, repaired 4 of the original 11, and developed a standardized frame that any competent carpenter could replicate from a set of drawn measurements Tolliff produced on drafting paper. The marriage did not transfer authorship. Tolliff never claimed the method. He claimed the frame, the structural improvement that made the panels last longer and fit tighter, and he was right to claim it because it was his. The 7 rules remained Randy's. The principle remained Guro's. The memory of the curtained bed remained her mother's. By the dramatized year of 1906, the method had become infrastructure. 27 farms across Steele and Rice counties had some version of the storm room. The designs varied. Some were closets, some were cabinets, some were full interior rooms built against a protected wall. But everyone carried the 7 painted rules. Randy had insisted on the rules from the first installation and had never relented. No open flame near insulation, no damp fill, no blocked vent, no ground-level bedding, no uninspected support structure, no oversized sleeping chamber, no claim that insulation replaced food. The rules were painted on a board beside the entrance of every structure. They were painted in the same order, in the same plain language, using the same dark paint on light wood that Guro had chosen for the original board inside the oak. 4 schoolhouses in the surrounding townships had rope lines strung between the school door, the privy, and the nearest farmhouse. The ropes were Randy's idea, borrowed from the guide rope she had tied between 3 trees along the final 100 yards to the oak. No child would cross a schoolyard in a whiteout without a hand on a line. The state school in Owatonna, the institution where Randy had spent 11 months as a child, sleeping in an iron bed beneath a ceiling that leaked in spring, used sewn insulating curtains in a demonstration room. A teacher had visited the Oak in 1902 and had asked Randy to explain the birth to a group of older children. Randy had agreed on one condition. The children performed the 3 tests: dry bundle, wet bundle, candle near the fiber, lie in the room, then lie in the birth. Feel the difference. She kept the Oak as a teaching site. Visitors entered sideways through the scarred entrance, crouched beneath the baffle, and saw the original sleeping berth, smaller than any of them expected, tighter than any space they would willingly occupy, and still dry after 18 years of seasonal use. Randy charged families who could pay. She traded labor with those who could not. She refused patents because the method depended on common materials and local judgment, not a proprietary device. A patent would have made the design someone's property. The design was meant to be everyone's practice. Ruth Krantz became the bookkeeper. She tracked installations, recorded temperature data from families who kept their own logs, and maintained the correspondence that arrived from as far away as Fargo and Duluth. Letters from people who had heard about the Oak and wanted to know if the method worked in their climate, their soil, their type of house. Ruth answered every letter. She used the same plain language Randy used when teaching, because Ruth had learned from watching Randy that technical knowledge delivered in complicated words was technical knowledge that never got applied. The phrase Oak Queen persisted. It had traveled from mockery through indifference into something that sounded, when spoken by people who had used the method, like a title earned rather than assigned. Randy did not use it herself. She did not correct people who did. Randy and Tolliff raised 2 children on the 5-acre parcel, a son born in 1899 and a daughter born in 1902. The house they built was not inside the tree. It was a modest frame structure with clapboard siding and a tin roof set on the high ground above the slough where the flood had not reached. At its center, where another builder might have placed a parlor or a dining room, Randy built a narrow, insulated sleeping room, 6 feet by 8 feet, cloth panels in a rigid pine frame, a high vent, a low vent, a raised floor. No flame permitted inside. The children slept there during every storm. They grew up believing that a sleeping room was a normal feature of a house. They did not understand until they were old enough to hear the full story that their mother had invented it inside a tree when she was their age. Tolliff continued building frames. His reputation as a cooper and cabinet maker grew alongside Randy's reputation as a designer, and the two reputations fed each other. Families who wanted a storm room wanted Tolliff's frame and Randy's panels, and families who wanted barrels or cabinets or shelving discovered that Tolliff's joints were as precise in furniture as they were in storm rooms. Each January 12th, Randy opened the old ledger, the one she had begun on a scrap of brown paper tucked behind the 10th panel, and added one line about that winter's coldest night. The temperature, the wind direction, whether the berth panels in the oak had held or needed repair. The entry was never more than 2 lines. It was not a celebration. It was a measurement. The giant oak declined gradually. A new vertical crack appeared in 1912, running along the old scar line from the upper canopy toward the entrance. Randy inspected it, measured the gap, and tapped the surrounding wood with the knife handle the way Guro had taught her 30 years earlier. The sapwood still rang. The tree was alive. But the crack widened the opening enough that wind entered the berth during storms, and the structural margin, already narrow, had narrowed further. Randy closed the cavity to sleeping. She did not close it to visiting. She did not close it to teaching. She continued bringing learners through the entrance, showing them the berth, letting them lie inside and feel the still air. But she hung a notice on the inner wall, in the same paint and the same plain language as the 7 rules. This shelter is no longer safe for overnight use. The support structure has changed. Inspect before you trust. The notice was the hardest thing she had written, harder than the ledger entries, harder than the letters to families in Fargo and Duluth. Because the notice admitted that the place that had saved her life had become the thing Kittredge once called it. Not a coffin, not yet, but a structure whose safety she could no longer guarantee. Her loyalty was to the principle, not the shape. Guro's voice was in that choice, the way Guro's voice was in every choice Randy made about when to build and when to stop, when to trust a structure and when to walk away. Keep the principle, change the shape. Randy continued teaching into the 1920s. By then, the method had become local knowledge, the kind of thing families passed along the way. They passed along canning techniques or fence-building shortcuts, without attribution, without formality, as part of the practical inheritance of living in a place where winter was not a season but a test. She did not mind the anonymity. She had never wanted credit. She had wanted the coughing to stop. She had wanted the children in the schoolhouse to have a rope to hold. She had wanted the families who could not afford enough firewood to have a room small enough that their bodies could warm it. Tolliff died in 1938, at 64, after a stroke that took his speech first and his breathing second. Randy sat beside him in the narrow sleeping room and held his hand, the hand that had built the frame she could not build, that had opened the rigid panel when she asked him to, that had held damp fiber and said nothing for a long time before admitting she was right. She lived 11 more years in the house on the 5-acre parcel. She tended the garden. She answered letters. She walked to the oak each spring to check the crack and tap the wood, and stand inside the cavity where the berth still hung, unused, patched, smoke-free, and small enough that a 12-year-old girl could have touched both walls with her elbows. The mirror Guro had placed on the upper shelf remained where Guro had placed it. The glass had clouded. The frame had darkened, but it caught the light from the knothole vent each morning, and Randy saw it each time she visited, and each time she did not move it. Randy Moen died in January of 1949 at 73 during a winter storm that arrived the way Minnesota storms always arrived, preceded by a warmth that felt like a gift, and followed by a wind that took the gift back. Her children found the ledger open on the table. The last entry, written in a hand that shook but did not waver, recorded the temperature at 6 o'clock that morning and the wind direction from the northwest. They preserved the inner berth panels, the mercury thermometer, and the first winter ledger. They placed them in the frame house's sleeping room behind glass, beside a photograph of a girl they had never known, 12 years old, 76 pounds, standing in front of a tree that was larger than the frame of the photograph could hold. By the time Randy stopped building, 27 documented storm rooms and dozens of informal adaptations stood across the surrounding counties. The shelters varied in size, material, and placement, but everyone carried the 7-rule notice painted in plain language on light wood. One surviving schoolhouse near Clinton Falls kept a child-sized wool curtain behind its stove room, copied from Randy's first birth, stitched by a teacher who had lain inside the oak and felt the difference between moving air and still. Randy lived the rest of her life on the parcel whose flood-prone soil had once made it nearly worthless. Her home was not inside the oak. It was a frame house with a narrow insulated sleeping room at its center, 6 feet by 8 feet, cloth panels in a pine frame, 2 vents, a raised floor, and a painted board beside the door. Each January 12th, she opened the old ledger and added one line about that winter's coldest night. She never skipped a year. The last entry was the 61st. Return to the sound of January 12th, 1888. Powder snow running sideways through the oaks. The entrance curtain pulling against its pegs. The trunk groaning above a child who cannot know whether morning will come. Alva Kittredge, standing on the river road in his constable's coat, had looked at the tree and said, "A hollow tree is a coffin with bark on it." Years later, his written copy of those words hung on a nail beside the original temperature ledger in the Clinton Falls schoolhouse. Below them sat the narrow sleeping berth, patched, smoke-free, and small enough that a 12-year-old could touch both walls with her elbows. Outside, snow crossed the abandoned doorway without entering the inner chamber. A wool curtain moved once in the still air, then settled. They had called it her coffin. She had measured it until it became a room,